admitting something that a lot of people guessed was the case, that the follow the science stuff, just repeating that ad nauseum, didn't do anything for confidence and trust in science and scientists. I can agree with that sentiment. It's not every day that I end up talking about an article in the Washington Post, but this particular one crossed my feed, and when I read it, it was actually quite a nice article. Pleasant bit of surprise there. So, admittedly, my first reaction was something a little different, but it was it was very interesting to see this. And my first reaction was something on the lines of, record scratch, like, what now? Because I primarily came across it because X was not kind necessarily to it. At least in some of the feedback I found, I'm sure others were in there that they were much nicer feedback about it. The comments on this are actually, for the most part, at least from what I skimmed, quite decent to it. And I myself, my take on this is it's actually a fairly nuanced piece and acknowledging certain things, but doesn't quite acknowledge other things which are quite relevant. So we're going to get into that in a minute. And for those of you who've been living under a rock the last 5 or 6 years, you might not have heard the phrase "follow the science." I personally dislike that phrase, and I'm a scientist day to day anyway. So, I never liked that phrase because it's not something to be followed, with the one exception of, following the research developments on something is a completely different thing from just trying to have a little bit of blind faith in something, because science is not that. It is a process by which we get at the truth about different things, and that does mean iterations and other things, as we'll get into in the article. I think this was actually quite an excellent piece in the Washington Post. This phrase was meant to increase trust in science. It backfired. Here's where follow the science went wrong. This is a guest opinion piece in the Washington Post. Adam Carroll, a pediatrician, is president and CEO of Academy Health, a nonpartisan group that advances evidence-based health policy. The Trump administration's 2025 budget proposed slashing the National Science Foundation's funding by 55% and the National Institutes of Health by nearly 40%, labeling many grants as wasteful. Meanwhile, recent surveys show public trust in scientists has dropped sharply, particularly among conservative voters, compared to pre-pandemic levels. The value of science itself is openly being challenged. Now, I don't know about the value of science itself, but I don't necessarily agree with that statement. But there's also a difference between trust in science and trust in scientists. You can think, I think I've hit on this before on this channel, but you can think that scientists are just royally, royally screwing things up. Or you can think they're great, or, any number of different things in between. And you can think science, the method, is great, is awesome. And I would go in that camp because it's led to some amazing discoveries. So there is that, but he's not wrong. I think a bunch of, what are these surveys? Yeah, this is a Pew Research one. There's other ones. There's other ones that show very similar. Also, I also follow the universities thing, of course, as I've done many times on this channel. The surveys about the trust in universities, those have dropped off too, though there's been a little bit of a rebound. I will give it that. There are a little bit others that'll tell you that too, that there's been a little bit of a rebound in some of the survey data related to that in the last few months, I think, primarily. So we'll see if it holds as a trend. But anyway, scientists, unfortunately, are partially to blame, partially being the key word. One of the scientific community's greatest contributing missteps was the very phrase meant to help: follow the science. Intended to inspire confidence, it became a common refrain at Centers for Disease Control and Prevention briefings and part of Joe Biden's pandemic plan. But science is evidence, not instruction. Science itself is not evidence, but, picking nits at that point. But science itself is not evidence. It is a process getting at the truth, which, of course, you require evidence for these things, and figuring out how the world works. You require evidence on these things. But anyway, treating it as something definitive to be followed shut down dialogue and dismissed all critics as anti-science. To win back trust, we need a new model of communication, one that clearly separates science from policy. I was actually really, really pleased to see this in here because, oh gosh, I think it was Scientific American, actually, if I remember correctly, that went off in this whole thing of every story is a science story. People forget, like, scientism is a somewhat irrational thing that science can solve and answer all questions, that you don't need philosophy or morals or ethics or other kinds of things. Um, there seems to be that kind of vein where, like, if you've let's put it this way, there's not necessarily a discussion of the philosophical underpinning, like what is the role of science versus the role of, say, something like the Supreme Court. I recall seeing that quite frequently when we had the Supreme Court cases, not the Dobbs decision, but I think it was the same year, like the EPA, one of the EPA decisions that came out that year. There was a couple of others that basically just there were folks jumping up and down saying the court is anti-science, the court is anti-science. No, maybe the question the court was adjudicating was not a science question, which would not be the role of the court to adjudicate those science questions anyway. It was a legal and policy question. Science can say X and X thing about X and X things, and that may be leading you to a policy to do something, but it can't say, no scientist can say whether or not a government entity has the authority to do that. That falls to the courts and to the Supreme Court, in particular when they interpret the Constitution, things like that. Science explains the facts as we currently understand them. Sound public policy, on the other hand, involves choices and trade-offs, balancing what we know, what we can reasonably predict, and what outcomes we want to achieve. I would add to this also competing interests. Add to that list competing interests, because when you're doing public policy, you do have multiple interests you have to address so that everybody can settle in on a policy, hopefully. We need to be honest about what science can and can't tell us. For example, studies tell us that vaccines are unmatched in preventing many communicable diseases. They also tell us that undercooked eggs carry a risk of salmonella. These two scientific truths inform very different policy responses. One may justify mandating vaccines in schools. The other certainly doesn't justify banning sunny side up eggs. And this is the thing. I'm so glad he put this in here. This is excellent piece to put in here, because despite the mockery of the title, the actual piece itself is quite good. From what I've read here, admittedly I skimmed it before, so I may run across something else as I'm reading it now. But I'm so glad to see this in here, because that's the difference. Is like science can tell us things, but unless we really want to get into the society where you're mandating certain things that individuals have no choice, that's going to be questions of debate and policy that society has to settle on. Do we want to do these things or do we not? Just because science says something doesn't mean it's the right policy decision to immediately do that. There's other competing interests involved in here when you're talking about a policy thing. Such nuance was often glossed over during the COVID-19 pandemic. Usually COVID is capitalized, so I'm confused by that. But anyway, at some point, health authorities settled on 6 feet of distance to limit viral spread. Why not 5 or Europe's 1 meter? Digging into literature, as many did, yields very little evidence justifying the number. It seemed more like a guess or compromise, yet it was repeatedly presented and received as an absolute truth, essential and non-negotiable. Even when challenged, officials rarely acknowledge the trade-offs of rigid public health guidance. In a 2021 press briefing, for instance, CDC Director Raquel Walensky was asked directly where the 6-foot number came from and whether it had been studied alongside masking. She reaffirmed that the number was based on prior studies and said that the CDC was revisiting the guidance, but didn't concede it might have been arbitrary despite the burden it placed on schools and communities. Such rigidity turned healthy skepticism into angry defiance. Yes. I've made the case and the point before that science as a discipline is trusted, has earned that trust for being one of our arbiters of figuring out what the truth is on certain things. That comes with a tremendous responsibility to acknowledge the limits and the failings of that. Um, or the uncertainty of that, or, well, maybe there isn't as much literature about this as we thought. That's something that happens quite frequently behind the scenes, actually, when you're dealing with researchers and the different scientists and what have you. They will acknowledge that there's, okay, well, maybe this isn't as great as that there. Maybe, maybe, oh, actually that's more solid than we thought. We should mention that, and all of these other kinds of things. It doesn't necessarily get communicated well in policymaking, for sure. And science communication, I'm sure if Gina was here, she'd have a lot of commentary on that. And I'm sure she will have a lot of commentary on that because she's probably going to see. I'm sure she will have a lot of commentary on that. I'll just leave it at that. But it can do that. But anyway, in much of that communication, follow the science, in quotes here, became a cudgel to dismiss criticism of policy as anti-science. This is the difference. You can agree that the underlying science is sound. You can also think the policy is shit. Or the reverse. You can think the underlying science is bullcrap and the policy is okay. Those two things can happen. I think the former is more likely than the latter, policy being shit and science being good. But anyway, science rarely offers a single uncontested answer. Officials could build more public trust by acknowledging that the same data can support different, reasonable interpretations. This brings us to another badly needed shift: openly admitting the limits, uncertainty, and complexity of scientific evidence. This presents a lot more nuanced conversation that would be worthwhile to have in terms of how do you deal with that and communicating the uncertainty side of things. Trying to remember exactly who it was, but there was a couple of science communicators who did great work a while back on words and common phrases and understanding in scientific disciplines that are, and how they are received, those same words are received, processed by just the general public. And one of the things that wasn't received well in the communication space was actually uncertainty. The word uncertainty was not received well by the general public, according to the survey studies in the communication section. It was viewed very negatively, where oftentimes most scientists are like, pretty just dang neutral, actually, on uncertainty, as it were. It's part of what we do. We know it's not necessarily perfect. In dealing with models, you're going to have uncertainty in the model. You're going to have uncertainty in observations. It's just a matter of it being there. It's not necessarily an ill for a scientist in most cases. But for the public, general public, it can be negatively received. It can be viewed like you don't know what you're doing. You don't know what you're saying when you start using things like uncertainty or the sort of hedging. So I know there's a desire not to do that. But he's not wrong at the same time that we need to acknowledge that there's uncertainties there in different sciences, right? As regardless of which one, acknowledging it is not a bad thing in and of itself. Take, for instance, a 2018 study on alcohol's health impacts published by The Lancet. The authors found that drinking even one serving of alcohol each day significantly raised the risk, for certain diseases and suggested that, from a purely scientific perspective, there was no safe level of alcohol consumption. Headlines blared this sentiment, drawing anxious clicks. Sidebar on this, actually, I may do a solo RJC on this, or I may see if Gina's got time to join in. But there's an article that we found recently that was basically analyzing the trends in hype in peer-reviewed articles. I'm reminded of that article reading this reading this line. I looked at the same paper and came away with a very different perspective. If you took 100,000 people who drank no alcohol, 914 of them could be expected to develop one of the associated diseases the following year. If another 100,000 people drank one alcoholic beverage daily, the number rose to 918, a difference of just 4 people. While excessive drinking substantially increased those risks, moderate consumption appeared to carry minimal additional risk for most people. The 914 to 918 thing, I bet you if you ran a statistical test on it, it would be insignificant. That's just a point of note there, but I have not read the paper in question, so I don't know. But yeah, there's differences in interpretation here that are a little bit involved. That are involved. Both perspectives, prohibition and moderation, are based on the same study and data. Which one follows the science? By misrepresenting scientific uncertainty as certainty, we forfeit public trust. Communicating science as rigid top down rules rather than nuanced guidance sows confusion and skepticism. Science itself shows this to be true. Without trust, more information doesn't solve the problem. It often makes it worse. Studies show that emphasizing fact based corrections without restoring trust paradoxically entrenches false beliefs. Oh gosh, I forget the short name for that, but there is a short name for what that is. Um, and yeah, I do know the studies that this guy's actually talking about here. Oh gosh, there's a short name for it. What that's called? What's that called? What that's called in communication and psychology? But I entirely am forgetting. When people who strongly believed the flu shot was caused, when strongly pe- when pe- let me try that one more time. When people who strongly believed the flu shot caused the flu were given corrective information from the CDC, they became less likely to be immunized. Immunized, yeah. How do we restore trust? As a pediatrician, I was taught to communicate with patients and parents openly and without judgment, to recognize complexity and uncertainty, and to build trust patiently, one conversation at a time. Public communication about science deserves the same. Our engagement with the public must be based on three key principles: communicating through empathy rather than fear, transparency rather than false certainty, and humility rather than authority. That also means reckoning honestly with our mistakes, including the slogan "Follow the science," when science alone rarely dictates what we should do. And it's that last point that is the critical one. Not every question is a science question. Not every story is a science story, no matter what Scientific American wants to say on that one. Pretty sure it was Scientific American. I could be wrong on that. I can't remember, but I remember reading the headline because I talked about it at the time. But he's right. He's right. Although I would add, there's one thing missing in this, in that aside from the false certainty side of things, um, scientists generally didn't engage in correcting crazy stuff coming out, or pushing back on some of that, such as the things like the quant crit stuff that NSF does, or some of those kinds of things. So there is that too to be concerned about. But all in all, not wrong, really. Not wrong at all in the slightest here, that there needs to be careful care with the communication side of things. And he's obviously talking about it a lot more with respect to medicine because that's where he is as a pediatrician. But it's a good lesson for science communication generally, to have a little bit of humility in it, to be transparent about what we know and what we don't know. And communicating through empathy. I mean, empathy on the one hand is that what that's been talked about in science communication circles as being sort of values based communication, to open your conversation about a scientific topic with shared values, which tends to work just generally when you're talking about conversations altogether with anybody. So this is really actually quite a good piece. And I know there's some folks online who are ridiculing it. And I mean, if you're just looking at the headline, I could see that, because the headline of the opinion piece here on the Washington Post was basically admitting something that a lot of people guessed was the case, that the follow the science stuff, just repeating that ad nauseum, didn't do anything for confidence and trust in science and scientists. I can agree with that sentiment. But give the piece a good read, actually, because it is quite good, and my kudos to the author. I very much agree with them. Let me know what you think. Hit the like button on the way there, comment on the video, share the video, subscribe to the channel, all that lovely good jazz. Until next time, I'm Adrian. May you stay curious.